Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls.
Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming March 13th.
You really want what happened to this woman that happened to you?
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find.
So am I.
Long Bright River. A limited series. Streaming March 13th. Only on Peacock.
Today on CityCast Philly.
I describe my womb space as the only place that really does belong to me. It is the only room in this vessel, in this house, that I call, a body, that I feel is absolutely mine, that I get to keep to myself because you can't see it. You can't feel what's happening in there. Yeah, shit about her that I don't tell you because she's mine.
That's a clip from an independently produced audio project called Of Black Wombhood. Tanya Latortu, my guest today, collected 10 intimate stories from Philadelphians about their wombs. This project isn't only about the womb as simply an organ, but as a prism into Black American history, identity, gender, sexuality, and so much more. It's Monday, March 10th. I'm Trenae Nuri, and here's what Philly's talking about. Tanya, I think we better start our conversation by defining the term wombhood as is in the title of this project. What is wombhood?
Sure. So I define wombhood as simply the state of having a womb and acknowledging that you have or have previously had a uterus. And so if that is something that aligns with your identity or your anatomy, that is how I would define it.
So this project was inspired after you went to a dinner party?
Yes, that's correct. So one of my homegirls hosted a supper club about 5 years ago called the Black Wombhood Supper Club. And it was a space for her friends to gather and talk about different fertility issues and experiences. But, when I went there, I found a space for me to share my story about having endometriosis and having that impact just my relationship to my body, to my womb, something that I hadn't really thought about before. Because I myself don't necessarily want to give birth or have children, but even sharing my experience with endometriosis in that space, I didn't feel like I couldn't connect with any of the other guests there. So yeah, after I went to that dinner, I told my friend, I'm like, oh, I was so inspired by this experience. I felt like I finally had the opportunity to talk about having endometriosis without, feeling ashamed or judged. I really want to do something with this, but I'm not sure what I want to do. I know I want to do an art project. Is it okay if I use your title for it? And she was like, sure. So that was the seed for the Of Black Wombhood project.
Do you want to just kind of go over what is endometriosis?
Sure. So endometriosis is a health condition that affects the reproductive organ. It's when the tissues or the cells that are supposed to grow inside of your uterus grow outside of it. And so sometimes you'll get additional tissue buildup on the exterior of the uterus or on the fallopian tubes. You can get cysts growing around the uterus or even on the ovaries. And it's diagnosed through a laparoscopy, which is a surgery where they take a camera to go in and see what the actual reproductive organs look like. And sometimes they'll treat some of the damage that they see. So in my case, I had stage 4 and there were adhesions, which are scars on the uterus all over the organ. And then I also had tissue buildup across my fallopian tube. So it looked like a spider web because I asked my surgeon to take pictures. So it was crazy. It did not look like the textbooks. And so they ended up puncturing some of the cysts and I had to go on hormone medication after. And that's usually the course of treatment. And they'll usually recommend that people try to get pregnant after or take birth control to help reduce the amount of tissue lining that grows around the uterus.
Wow. These 10 stories from Black Philadelphians are non-narrated, meaning there is no guide or reporter or someone walking you through these storylines. Creatively, can you explain what your vision was for making that choice?
I wanted there to be an art exhibition, but for a long time, I wasn't sure what the format of the art exhibition would be. And the more, I talked to different folks and started reflecting on what inspired this in the first place, including a lot of the research that I did on, wombhood across Black history and how it connected to the present, I thought storytelling is probably the best format for this. If there are people out there who think about their wombs or have a womb specific story that resonates with them or defines their life experience, they should be the ones who are highlighted in this art exhibition. And so I started researching different audio methods, and oral history really sat with me because it's an opportunity for someone to speak about their own lived experiences through their own words in their own way without any censoring. And so I wanted it to focus specifically on the narrator without me having to interject. And obviously, each of these stories are edited, so they're vignettes. But the vignettes focus on the apotheosis of their own story. So, the beginning and then how they get to their wombhood journey and the end. And it kind of forces you to be patient, to sit and to listen and to find a space to care and empathize with what they're bringing, because they're all volunteers and they're all sharing very vulnerable experiences.
Right. People are very vulnerable with you. And so how did you get people to open up to you in that way and to explain their stories in a way? Because when you have a natural conversation, sometimes your thoughts lead to other thoughts and it's not as clear. So you kind of had to craft your questions a certain way, right?
I did. And the interesting thing is, so I don't have any journalism or interviewing experience, but I did spend some time working with this really great story development consultant named Allison Behringer, who has a show called Bodies, whose episode Bleeding partially inspired this project as well. And she helped me come up with a structure of questions that I could bring into it. And, one of the things I learned is I was making a lot of assumptions about, how people think about their bodies or wombs or whether they think about it in the first place. And so we came up with some very boilerplate questions that I could start to make people feel comfortable about just getting to the story. But interestingly, Trinae, I think people who did this project were just ready to talk. A lot of them were sharing experiences for the first time that they hadn't really spoken to anyone else about them before. And so once they kind of got to the beginning of their wombhood story, I didn't even really need the questions anymore. The conversation just continued to flow very organically, which made it really, really hard to edit down the oral history interviews. But once we got going, they just talked and I listened and just gave them space to say whatever they wanted to say. And the editing process was iterative. And so I wanted them to hear how I was constructing the shortened version. And I wanted them to have a say in what they felt okay or not okay with having be public to the world. So yeah, it was pretty easy after we started talking.
Let's listen to some of these stories. Ariel from Brewery Town, she tells her story of how she experienced her wombhood, having her first period, how she managed some difficult symptoms, and the challenging choice of divorce when she couldn't conceive a child.
I even remember at one point writing down what would happen if you managed yourself, your body, like you manage your work, And that mentality, once that came in, when I looked at my body, my mental, in the way that I had been looking at work, the way I'd been cherishing work as like my child, it shifted things for me in a pretty major way. I think the way that it's started to reframe itself for me is that there's beauty in embracing the uncontrollable, just letting go and not over planning, even just embracing those times where things don't go according to plan, and how my body sometimes will push that for me, which I have a deeper sense of gratefulness for. There is this increase that has been built up of how lucky am I that my body is telling me to just sit down, that my body is giving me a reason to rest. Because, those that don't rest deal with all kinds of health issues over time. And I wonder about other Black women around me that don't hold space for that. And so there's still some reservation around that part of themselves, protectiveness, perhaps.
Tanya, I'm curious. These stories aren't just about wombs, this particular organ. These stories encompass the whole body and how bodies function in this world, especially in Philly. I heard a lot of topics of menstruation, abortion, birth control, the idea of the last call, which is like this idea of like having to rush your body to have a baby, relationships, motherhood, embracing our bodies. There's so much to uncover. Did anything surprise you during this process of collecting all of these stories?
Yeah, I would say from the very beginning, even before I started talking to people, I had to think of the womb outside of an internal entity. And I saw academic research specifically to see like how this shows up, right, within the world that we live in. And you start to see the connections between the figure of the Black body specifically and the womb and how much they contribute to how people see us and how we see ourselves. And that starts from, American slavery, where, there were breeding farms and then there was medical experimentation on Black bodies without their consent. And then obviously how that transcended to different types of health and scientific research. And then there's how Black bodies are exploited for anti-abortion causes, how people are treated in medical care settings, the information that we receive or don't receive about how to take care for our bodies, how cultural influences impact how we think about ourselves. One of the themes, shame, came up a lot in a lot of these people's stories, people not wanting to talk about their periods or sexuality or whatever. And it made me think of the womb as like this like central focus within a larger universe around which all these things orbit. And so I was like, that's really powerful to me. And I think trying to remember that, but also anchoring myself in the fact that even though this past is really dark, how do these people's stories bring light is where I started to see a lot of things that I didn't expect. And so people saying that even though they went through these really difficult moments, that they still see light, at the end of the tunnel, having an abortion be so impactful, but still finding joy in your body, having to go through so many different fertility treatments, but still feeling pride and now learning to deal with the trauma of, DNCs after having uterine atony, which is a very difficult experience, finding confidence in your gender identity despite this wrestling that you have with your womb. A lot of those things surprised me. So finding the light was something that I wasn't sure was going to come up, but it did. And I'm glad it does because it makes for a hopeful understanding of what wombhood is.
Tanya and I will continue our conversation about Black wombhood after this break.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with a Business Unlimited smartphone plan. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second internet plan with savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
If people don't know by now, I am a proud Black woman. And as I listened to these stories, I did think about my own self and my own identity and how I viewed my body as I have been growing up as a little girl in my early adulthood and now Tanya, what have you learned about yourself in this project?
I learned that I can make more space to listen and to become more radically compassionate. I think having people come share these very vulnerable stories is an offering, and there's like an immense responsibility that you have to carry their words into the public light. And like I said before, I don't have a lot of interviewing experience, journalism experience. There's certainly a lot of ethical considerations that I had to go into making this project. And
Like what?
like, how do you define care in a space, right? How do you give a storyteller agency when you have the power to construct the narrative? Editing can be seen as like a technical process, but there are also more abstract considerations to it. Like, are you representing this person the way that they want to? And I think with traditional journalism, there's not always that back and forth between the storyteller and the writer. It's mostly like, I trust you to represent me in this way, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But here, I wanted the narrator to be involved every step of the way. And that requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of listening. I want to hear you how you want to be heard rather than how I just hear what you're saying. So there's a lot. So I think now, having done this project, I'm learning more how to listen to people and to listen to understand, not to just react, and to be more compassionate, because these people show up initially one way, and then you kind of open up that box and you see them in a completely different light at the end of the interview. And everyone walks around as a container of experiences every day. And we shouldn't, make harsh judgments about who we think they are. So that's something that I'm learning through this project.
You talked about how people told you that, they often didn't have a space to kind of talk about these issues. Is that what you ultimately want from this project? To create more spaces to have these conversations?
I do. I think one of the things I hope to attain is this different sense of community and how we engage with stories. Because when people hear the term womb, I mean, first of all, it's not something that we use. It's not a term that we use regularly. Sometimes when you say it, people are like, what? They think you said wound, or, it doesn't resonate with them immediately. But it's like, it's all of our first home, regardless of who you are. And so, thinking about it with that type of respect and understanding that it might not always just be about the fact that it's this organ designed for gestation. It's like it carries with it so much more meaning. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this art exhibition around it, to allow for people to engage with it, even if they don't engage with the podcast format. Specifically, they can go into the space, and we really leaned on this idea of layering collage. And so our exhibition is going to be featuring visual collage by this local artist, Kara Mashenda, who will be rendering portraits of each of the project narrators, and to highlight different elements of their stories that kind of show up in a collage portrait. And it will always also feature a sonic collage by a sound designer, J.L. Simonson, who's going to be excerpting some of their audio into this soundscape so that you can really experience the wombhood in an immersive way. And if people don't engage with all 10 episodes individually, they can hopefully come into this art space and feel like they're experiencing wombhood in a unique way, in an experimental way, and then have some curiosity about I want to learn more about this person and then talk about this with my friends or someone else that I meet when it's appropriate and relevant, of course.
Now, that's an interesting point I thought about, because it's really about maybe changing the perspective of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
But what does the person experiencing, where can they turn to, right? And I thought about more of community. And that's when Ja's story comes to mind. Ja talks about his body and connection to his womb in a really proud way as a trans man, and how Philly helped.
I spent a lot of years in North Carolina feeling lost, depressed, lonely. And when I moved to Philly, things definitely changed. I ended up starting my transition while I was in Philly. So I think I just grew closer to myself and let myself open up more in order to allow people to come into my life. Oddly enough, I feel like my interactions in Philly were the first time I had real relationships with folks who were like non-binary, gender fluid, also trans themselves. So in a sense, it was the first time I saw myself reflected. That was a huge help. And it also lessened the fear that I had about stepping into my transness, because when I finally realized what was going on, because it took me quite a while to realize what was going on, I was like, I could never do that. I don't think I could live my life that way. I don't know. I feel like being gay was a lot. Coming out was a lot. Being also mask presenting was a lot. So it's just like eyes were always on me. And I feel like I got tired of just being this person that someone ogled at, you know? I just got tired of feeling different. And when I finally realized I was trans, I was like, I'm too scared. But like to see other people live in their truth definitely did help me embrace my own.
Everyone's story is so unique, but Philly is a common thread. Why was it important for you maybe to do this project in Philly?
I will be honest and say that Philly wasn't always the center of this project. I kind of picked up working on this project after I moved back to Philly in 2021, 2022. But once I started continuing the research that I had started back, in New York, I realized like Philly is important for a lot of reasons. The first of which is because it's often regarded as the first medical city of the United States. There's so many medical and health institutions that have probably grown their capacity because of the contribution of bodies that were used for research, specifically Black bodies. And then it just really was important now to tie in these stories with this geographic tapestry, which is Philly. Philly has a really rich and thriving birth worker community. So many doulas and other types of birth workers have gotten the blueprint from the movements that are happening here in Philadelphia with a lot of reproductive justice systems and organizations. Dorothy Roberts, who is a professor at Penn, has grown her career and done a lot of research on reproductive justice rights and laws, womb laws. She writes about it in her book, and she's based here in Philadelphia. And so you have this whole community and these people who can really tap into each of those sectors. I think it just ended up working out really beautifully that the project flourished here.
Is Philly doing enough for folks with wombs?
I would say that Philly knows that it needs to do more. I know that the public health department recently published a maternal, health statistics, which has shown that, Black bodies are still at higher risk for maternal mortality and morbidity, especially here in Philadelphia, that, post-birth, a lot of, babies and mothers need to be cared for in a way that integrates more holistic practices, more attention to care, more robust health resources that are often not provided to them. And so I would say, yes, I think that local communities are recognizing and acknowledging that and doing all that they can to support and help provide resources. But if these statistics are still the same and they're not changing, it definitely points to some improvements that can be made, even in experiences where trauma is addressed, right? You could have a successful birth, but, the whole mental health aspect of it might not be treated in a way that will allow you to fully recover. So I think there's a lot more that can be done.
Tanya Latortu, thank you so much for this conversation on CityCast Philly.
Thank you so much for lifting up this project, Trinae. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
You can listen to all 10 stories of Black Wombhood at theblackwombhoodproject.com. We'll have a link in the show notes and on Apple, Spotify. And the project will be featured in a public art exhibition opening this week on Thursday at the Tilt Institute for Contemporary Image and in June at the Da Vinci Art Alliance. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this episode about these really intimate stories of Black wombhood, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.